it is probably true that our, to some degree, we organize our editorial focus around the particular strengths and of our sort of most talented journalists. I'll give you an example. David Rogers came from the Wall Street Journal. He's in late careers, in his 60s or whatever, it's his last job, but and he would never think of himself as a sort of a new media person. But in the reality, he is. Like, he understands the congressional appropriations process, budget politics, big story right now, better than almost any.
The proliferation of the types of media, they have been bombarded with them. That it's no longer a job that these offices can even do on their end, the people we cover, which I have found personally really interesting. The Speaker's office has a press secretary that just deals with people that call to ask questions about the relationship with the White House. I mean, that's just, it's insane.
I want to be like a great place to work, and I think it is a great place to work, and has been from day one for certain types of folks, and been a hard place to work for other types who need that support. But like in the early days, this was like a garage band that we were doing. We now have 140 people on our editorial staff, so we do. The last thing I want is to be kind of bureaucratic, well, go see HR department in door 2 or whatever. I don't want to do that, but we do need an editorial support structure, and enough just actual editors, newsroom leaders, that people can get the individual attention. In the early days, what was happening is they'd get in, there was only a handful of us who could really give the direction, and so I could kind of, like Jim and John or whatever, but I hardly ever talked to them. I mean, first off, Sue's publication, mine, we make money in a particular context, Washington, D.C., where there's a lot of people who want to reach Washington influentials, people who are involved as decision makers in the public policy process. And so they'll pay to advertise next to that content. Or in some ways they'll just pay to purchase the content because it's useful for them professionally. Like that's not true in Minneapolis. I've got a pretty good friend who's the managing editor of the Star Tribune. But it isn't true in Washington. There's a lot of people that want to reach those eyeballs. To me, though, and I understand the questions like, well, yeah, but look, really, you're making your money off the old model and sort of making some off the new model. It's not really true. Like, go back to what I said initially. Like, I think that the future of sort of editorially strong and financially strong publications, I do think the two need to go together. I'm not into news organizations being subsidized by charitable foundations or as wards of some other more profitable part of a business. I'm into them being financially and strong, because to me it's the way to be sort of editorially independent and editorially confident enough to do first-class journalism.
I still think you have to go through the traditional route. I mean, the reason why people want to read Mike Allen when he writes about the White House is because he's covered the White House, and he brings a certain amount of expertise to still what he writes about. It's not just necessarily about being a good writer, being a personality, or being promotional. Same thing with David Rogers. This is someone who covered the budget for probably longer than any reporter in Washington at this point. And people, again, we write for a highly specialized audience. So I don't know if readers in Kansas are like, oh, David Rogers in the budget. But to our advertisers, to our readers, to the kind of people we want coming to our sites, the sort of influential eyeballs, they know who David Rogers is. And when something happens when they avert a government shutdown and you want to read a story, a lot of times you think, well, I want to know what David Rogers has to say about that. But I still think, it probably still takes time. Just time put in to build the kind of reputation it takes to be the kind of person that people go to read. A good example, too, is even David Leonhardt, still a pretty young guy, but is now, and writes with voice and writes with analysis, and it covers economics for the New York Times. He still covered economics for 15 years before he got to be to the point where people were going there just to read him.
That's the power, the kind of agenda-setting power, and that's the power that we're all associated with. That's in the old days. Then I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm now in one of those positions of responsibility. The rules have changed. It was around me there was evidence all around me that we would, what we would put on the front page of the Washington Post sometimes was the most important story in politics, but a lot of times it might be something that somebody not affiliated with any of the big institutions at all was sort of driving the day. The phrase I always use was driving the conversation. What are people talking about? And you know what I mean by that. Like what's the story that people are emailing around? What's the story that the politicians and the public officials are forced to respond to? But that could come, because of the web primarily, that could come from an almost infinite variety of sources. Sometimes from us at the Post, a lot of times not. Or what was interesting to me was that the story that might be like deep in the paper, but for some reason had something kind of interesting about it, that would be by far the most read or most emailed story that day, not the story that was the lead of the paper on the front page. It made me realize, like, what if you did a publication where you were only organized around, like, what's that story that everybody's going to be talking about? You could do it. It seemed to me that there were certain types of journalists that in this new, kind of more competitive web environment there was a premium on the kind of work that they did.